The blizzard struck so suddenly that Preston Archer barely had time to tie his bandana over his mouth before the world turned white and howling. He had been riding through the Texas Panhandle for 3 days straight, heading toward Tascosa with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and the weight of solitude that had been his only companion for the better part of 2 years. The wind screamed across the plains with a fury he had never experienced, even in his 31 years of living rough on the frontier. His gelding, a sturdy paint named Duke, whinnied nervously as ice crystals began forming on his mane. Preston squinted through the assault of snow and wind, searching desperately for any kind of shelter. The temperature had plummeted so fast that his fingers were already going numb despite his leather gloves. This was no ordinary winter storm. This was the kind of weather that killed men and animals alike, leaving their frozen corpses to be discovered when spring finally arrived. He had heard stories of such storms from old-timers who sat around saloon stoves, but experiencing it was something altogether different. Through the white chaos, he spotted what looked like a dark shape rising from the snow-covered landscape. It could have been a rock formation or perhaps an abandoned structure. Either way, it was his only hope. He urged Duke forward, the horse struggling through snow that was already knee-deep and getting deeper by the minute. As they drew closer, Preston realized it was indeed some kind of building, a small cabin that looked like it had been abandoned for some time. He dismounted and led Duke to what remained of a lean-to on the side of the structure. It would have to do. He quickly unsaddled the horse and rubbed him down as best he could with his nearly frozen hands, then pushed open the cabin door. The hinges protested with a rusty screech, and Preston stumbled inside, his legs weak from fighting the storm. The interior was dark and cold, but at least the walls provided protection from the wind. He fumbled in his saddlebag for matches and managed to light one with trembling fingers. The small flame revealed a single room with a fireplace, a rough wooden table, and what looked like a bed in the corner. More importantly, there was a stack of wood beside the fireplace. Preston sent up a silent prayer of thanks and quickly set about building a fire. As the flames began to grow and cast dancing shadows around the room, Preston noticed something strange near the back wall. At first, he thought it was just an odd formation of ice that had somehow built up inside the cabin. But as he looked closer, his heart nearly stopped. There was a person inside the ice. A woman. He grabbed his lantern from his pack and lit it, holding it close to the ice. The warm glow revealed her more clearly now. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark hair that seemed to float in the frozen water around her face. Her eyes were closed, her expression peaceful, almost serene. She wore a simple dress that looked like it had once been a deep blue. Around her neck was a small silver locket. Preston's throat tightened as he realized what he was looking at. This woman had somehow become trapped in ice, likely during some previous storm, and had been preserved here ever since. He should have been horrified, should have turned away and focused on his own survival. But something about her face held him captive. She was beautiful, even in death, with delicate features and full lips that seemed to curve in the slightest hint of a smile. Preston reached out and touched the ice, feeling its solid coldness beneath his palm. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling like a chorus of wolves. Preston knew he would be trapped here for at least a day, maybe longer. He built up the fire until it was roaring, filling the small cabin with blessed warmth. He tended to Duke, bringing him inside to share the heat, though the horse was skittish about the frozen woman. As the hours passed and the cabin grew warmer, Preston found himself unable to stop looking at the woman in the ice. Who was she? How had she ended up here? The questions plagued him as he ate a meager meal of jerky and hardtack. He had been alone for so long, drifting from town to town, working cattle drives and odd jobs, never staying anywhere long enough to form connections. After the war had taken his younger brother and a fever had claimed his parents, he had found it easier to be solitary. Loneliness was a familiar companion, one that did not ask questions or make demands. But looking at this woman, Preston felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt in years. It was foolish, he knew. She was dead, had been for who knew how long. Yet he could not shake the feeling that there was something different about this situation, something he did not understand. He must have dozed off, because he woke with a start to the sound of cracking. For a moment, he thought the cabin was collapsing under the weight of snow, but then he realized the sound was coming from the ice. The heat from the fire had been working on it for hours now, and it was beginning to melt. Preston scrambled to his feet and approached cautiously. Water was pooling on the floor beneath the ice, and the cracks were spreading like a spider's web across the surface. He watched in fascination as more and more of the ice fell away, revealing the woman within. This was impossible. The ice should have taken days to melt, not hours. Then, even more impossibly, the woman's chest moved. It was just the slightest rise and fall, but Preston saw it clearly. His heart hammered in his chest as he rushed forward, helping to clear away the remaining ice. Her skin was cold as marble, but there was color beginning to return to her cheeks. Her eyes opened. They were green, the color of new grass in spring, and they focused on Preston with an intensity that made him take a step back. She drew in a gasping breath, then another, her whole body shuddering as if she were being pulled back from some vast distance. "You are alive," Preston managed to say, his voice hoarse with disbelief. She looked at him for a long moment, water dripping from her hair and clothes. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "You saved me." Preston did not know what to say to that. He had not saved her. He had simply built a fire to keep himself from freezing. But the look in her eyes told him that she believed otherwise. He grabbed a blanket from his bedroll and wrapped it around her shoulders. She was shaking violently now, her teeth chattering so hard he worried she might chip them. "We need to get you warm," he said, guiding her toward the fire. She moved stiffly, as if her limbs were not quite under her control yet. He helped her sit down close to the flames and quickly heated water in a small pot he had. When it was warm, he handed her a cup and she drank it gratefully, her hands wrapped around the warmth. "What is your name?" Preston asked gently. "Louisa," she replied, her voice growing stronger. "Louisa Langford." "I am Preston Archer. Can you tell me what happened to you? How you ended up in that ice?" Louisa's eyes grew distant, as if she were looking at something far away. "The storm came so fast. My husband and I were traveling to Tascosa. He wanted to start a new life there, open a store. We thought we could make it before the weather turned, but we were wrong." Her voice caught. "The wagon overturned. James hit his head. I tried to help him, but he was already gone. I managed to get to this cabin, but the cold was so intense. I remember filling a water barrel to have something to drink, and then I do not remember anything else. The water must have frozen around me." "How long ago was this?" Preston asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. 2 weeks ago. Late November of 1885. Preston felt the blood drain from his face. "Louisa, it is January of 1886 now. You have been frozen for more than a month." She stared at him, her green eyes wide with shock. "That cannot be possible." "I do not understand it either, but you were completely encased in ice when I found you. You should not be alive, but here you are." He paused, then added gently, "I am sorry about your husband." Tears welled up in Louisa's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. Preston felt helpless in the face of her grief, but he moved closer and let her lean against him as she wept. She cried for a long time, her body shaking with more than just cold. He held her, this stranger who had been given back her life in a way that defied all logic and reason, and felt his own heart breaking for her loss. When her tears finally subsided, she pulled back and looked at him. "You must think me a madwoman, crying all over a stranger." "I think you have every right to cry," Preston said. "You have been through something no person should have to endure." She studied his face in the firelight, and something shifted in her expression. "Why are you alone out here? A man traveling by himself in weather like this?" Preston found himself telling her things he had not spoken of in years. About his family, about the war, about the emptiness that had driven him from place to place. Louisa listened without judgment, her green eyes never leaving his face. "So you see," he finished, "I am just a lonely cowboy with nowhere particular to go and no one waiting for me when I get there." "That is the saddest thing I have ever heard," Louisa said softly. "A man should have a home, should have people who care whether he lives or dies. What about you?" Preston asked. "What will you do now?" Louisa looked down at her hands. "I do not know. James and I had no family. We were both orphans who found each other in Houston. Everything we owned was in that wagon, and it is surely buried under snow by now. I have nothing and no one." She raised her eyes to his again. "Except you. You brought me back. In a way, you gave me a second chance at life." The storm continued through the night and into the next day. Preston and Louisa stayed in the cabin, sharing what little food he had and talking by the fire. He learned that she had been married for only 8 months before the tragedy, that she could read and write, and had a talent for sewing, that she loved the smell of rain and the sound of meadowlarks singing. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that occasionally surprised a laugh from her, that he was patient and kind, that his hands were calloused from years of hard work, but could be surprisingly gentle. On the second morning, the wind finally died down and the snow stopped falling. Preston stepped outside and surveyed the landscape. Everything was buried under at least 3 feet of snow, the world transformed into an endless expanse of white. He would need to dig out Duke and find food for the horse. They would also need to search for Louis's husband's body and give him a proper burial once the ground thawed. When he came back inside, Louisa was standing by the window, looking out at the snow. "It is beautiful," she said, in a terrible sort of way. "We are going to have to stay here for a few more days," Preston told her. "The trails will be impassable." She turned to face him. "Preston, I need to say something." He waited, watching her face. "When I was in the ice, I was aware, not all the time, but in moments. I could not move, could not speak, but I could feel the cold consuming me. I knew I was dying, and then I felt warmth and I heard a voice, your voice, and I fought my way back." She took a breath. "I know this will sound strange, but I feel like I was given back my life for a reason. Like I was meant to survive so I could meet you." Preston's heart was pounding. "Louisa, you have just lost your husband. You are in shock and confused." "I am not confused," she said firmly. "I love James and I will mourn him, but he is gone and I am here and I know what I feel. When you held me while I cried, when you shared your food and your story, I felt something I never felt before. Not even with James. It was like recognizing something I did not know I was missing." Preston wanted to tell her she was wrong, that what she felt was just gratitude and the aftermath of trauma. But the truth was, he felt it too. In these 2 days, Louisa had become more important to him than anyone he had known in years. The loneliness that had been his constant companion had vanished, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I am yours forever," Louisa said simply. "If you will have me, I know it is too soon, I know it does not make sense, but I have been given a miracle. I do not want to waste it." Preston crossed the small cabin in 3 strides and took her hands in his. They were warm now, no longer the frozen marble they had been. "I am just a drifter with nothing to offer you," he said. "I have a little money saved, but no home, no prospects." "Then we will build them together," Louisa said. "We will go to Tascosa, the town James and I were heading toward. We will start the life he wanted, but we will start it together. Is that not a fitting tribute to his memory?" Preston looked into her green eyes and saw his future there. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. "Are you sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." He kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing passion. She responded in kind, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck. The kiss held the promise of everything they could be together. All the lonely days left behind for a future they would build side by side. Over the next 3 days, they waited for conditions to improve. Preston ventured out to hunt and managed to bring down a rabbit, which they roasted over the fire. They talked for hours about their plans, about the store they would open in Tascosa, about the life they would make. Louisa proved to be resourceful and clever, full of ideas about what goods would sell best and how they could make a success of themselves. On the 4th day, Preston found the wagon. It had overturned in a ravine about half a mile from the cabin. He also found James Langford's body, frozen solid and half buried in snow. Working alone, he dug a grave as best he could in the frozen ground, piling rocks over it to keep scavengers away. Louisa insisted on coming with him to say goodbye. She stood in the bitter cold, her hand in Preston's, and spoke her farewell to the man she had married. "I am sorry it ended this way, James. You deserved better. You deserved a long life and all the success you dreamed of. I will honor your memory by living the life you wanted for us, even if it is with someone else. I hope you can forgive me for that. I hope you understand." Preston added a prayer of his own, then they made their way back to the cabin. That night, Louisa cried again, but it was a different kind of tears. These were tears of letting go, of accepting what could not be changed, of choosing to move forward. A week after the storm had trapped Preston in the cabin, they set out for Tascosa. Duke carried both of them, and they moved slowly through the snow-packed landscape. Preston had salvaged what he could from the wagon, including a small strongbox that contained the money James and Louisa had saved. It was not a fortune, but combined with Preston's savings, it would be enough to rent a building and stock it with basic goods. The journey took 3 days. They spent the nights huddled together for warmth, talking and planning and stealing kisses. Preston felt like a different man than the lonely cowboy who had ridden into that storm. He had purpose now, and more importantly, he had someone to share his life with. Tascosa was a rough frontier town on the banks of the Canadian River, populated by cowboys, buffalo hunters, and the occasional outlaw. The main street was lined with saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, and various other businesses. It was not much, but it had potential. They found a building that had been a restaurant, but had closed when the owner moved on to greener pastures. The owner was willing to rent it cheap, and Preston and Louisa immediately set to work. They scrubbed the place from top to bottom, built new shelves, and used their combined funds to stock inventory. Preston rode to other towns to negotiate deals with suppliers, while Louisa designed the layout and prepared the store for opening. Word spread quickly in a small town, and people were curious about the new arrivals. There was gossip, of course. Some people thought it was scandalous that a widow was living with a man she was not married to so soon after her husband's death. Louisa bore the whispers with dignity, but Preston could see they hurt her. 3 weeks after arriving in Tascosa, Preston took care of that problem. He found the circuit preacher at the local saloon and asked him to perform a wedding ceremony. The preacher was a weathered man named Reverend Hoskins who had seen enough of life not to judge. "You too sure about this?" he asked, looking between Preston and Louisa. "Marriage is not something to rush into." "I am 31 years old and have been alone most of my adult life," Preston said. "I know what I want, and it is her." Louisa squeezed his hand. "And I have already lost one chance at happiness. I am not going to lose another because people think it is too soon. Life is short. The storm taught me that." Reverend Hoskins married them the next day in the small church at the edge of town. There were no guests except for Duke, who Preston had tied up outside. Louisa wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric they had ordered for the store, a simple white cotton that made her look like an angel. Preston wore his best shirt and had even trimmed his beard. When Reverend Hoskins pronounced them man and wife, Preston kissed Louisa with all the love and gratitude in his heart. She was his miracle, his second chance, and he was determined to spend the rest of his life making her happy. The store, which they named Langford and Archer General Goods as a tribute to both their pasts, opened a week later. Business was slow at first, but gradually picked up as people realized they offered fair prices and quality merchandise. Louisa had a gift for talking to customers and understanding what they needed, while Preston proved adept at managing the inventory and negotiating with suppliers. Spring came to the Texas Panhandle in a burst of wildflowers and warm winds. The snow melted, revealing the bones of the land beneath. Preston and Louisa worked from dawn to dusk, building their business and their life together. They rented a small house on the outskirts of town, a two-room structure that was not much to look at but was theirs. One evening in late April, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Louisa took Preston's hand and placed it on her stomach. "We are going to have a baby," she said softly. Preston felt his eyes fill with tears. "Are you sure?" "I am sure." The doctor confirmed it this afternoon. He pulled her into his arms and held her close, overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. Less than 6 months ago, he had been a lonely drifter with no purpose or direction. Now he had a wife he loved beyond measure, a business that was thriving, and a child on the way. It was more than he had ever dared to hope for. The pregnancy was not easy. Louisa suffered from morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon, and the Texas heat in summer made her uncomfortable. But she never complained, and Preston did everything he could to make her comfortable. He brought her cool water, rubbed her feet when they swelled, and read to her from the newspaper in the evenings. The store continued to do well. They hired a young man named Timothy to help with the heavy lifting and to mind the store when Preston needed to be away. Timothy was 18 and eager to learn, and he quickly became a valuable part of their operation. As Louisa's belly grew, Preston found himself thinking often about the storm that had brought them together. He had gone back to the cabin once in early summer to see if he could make sense of what had happened. The ice formation where he had found Louisa was completely melted, leaving no evidence of the miracle that had occurred there. He had stood in the small cabin and tried to understand how she had survived, but there were no answers to be found. Some things, he supposed, were simply beyond human understanding. In November of 1886, exactly 1 year after Louisa had been frozen in the ice, she went into labor. Preston paced outside their bedroom while the midwife, a stern woman named Mrs. Fletcher, attended to Louisa. The sounds of his wife's pain tore at his heart, but there was nothing he could do except wait and pray. After what seemed like an eternity, he heard a baby's cry. Mrs. Fletcher opened the door and beckoned him inside. Louisa was propped up against pillows, her face pale and exhausted but radiant with joy. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. "It is a boy," she said, her voice weak but happy. A healthy, perfect boy. Preston approached slowly, almost afraid to believe this was real. He looked down at his son, at the tiny face with its button nose and closed eyes, and felt his heart expand in his chest. "He is beautiful," he whispered. "What should we name him?" Louisa asked. Preston thought for a moment. "James," he said, "after your first husband." He may not be here to see this, but his dream of a life in Tascosa came true. It seems right to honor that. Louisa's eyes filled with tears. "James Preston Archer. It is perfect." The baby thrived, growing stronger and healthier with each passing day. Preston discovered that fatherhood suited him. He loved holding his son, loved watching him sleep, loved the way James's tiny hand would curl around his finger. The loneliness that had defined his life for so long was now a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of family and purpose. The store continued to prosper. By the spring of 1887, they were doing well enough to buy the building outright and to start thinking about expanding. Preston hired 2 more employees, and they began carrying a wider range of goods. Louisa, even with a baby to care for, proved to be an astute businesswoman, keeping meticulous records and identifying trends in what people wanted. As James grew from an infant to a toddler, he proved to be a happy, curious child with his mother's green eyes and his father's strong build. He was fascinated by everything in the store, and Preston often found him reorganizing the shelves in ways that made no sense but delighted the boy. In the summer of 1888, Louisa became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in March of 1889 she gave birth to a daughter they named Emma Marie. Emma was a quiet baby, content to watch the world with solemn, dark eyes that reminded Preston of his own mother. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The store remained the center of their world, but it no longer consumed all their time. Preston made sure to close early on Sundays so they could spend time as a family. They would go on picnics by the Canadian River, or simply sit on their porch and watch the children play. Tascosa grew around them, evolving from a rough frontier town into a more established community. A school was built, and a proper church replaced the small structure where Preston and Louisa had been married. They made friends, became pillars of the community, and built a life that was far richer than Preston had ever imagined possible. On quiet nights when the children were asleep and the store was locked up tight, Preston and Louisa would sit together and talk about how strange and wonderful their journey had been. Louisa would sometimes trace the line of Preston's jaw with her finger and tell him again that she was his forever, just as she had promised on that day when she had thawed from the ice. "You ever wonder why it happened?" Preston asked her one night as they lay together in the darkness. "Why you survived when by all rights you should have died?" "I think some things are not meant to be understood," Louisa replied. "I think sometimes the universe gives us gifts, and we are meant to accept them with gratitude rather than question them. You needed someone to love, and I needed someone to save me. We found each other in the middle of a storm, and everything else followed from that." "I thank God for that storm every day," Preston said, "even though it was terrifying at the time." "So do I," Louisa said. "It took away James, and I will always carry that sadness with me. But it gave me you and our children and this life. I would not change it, even if I could." As the years passed, their family continued to grow. In 1891, Louisa gave birth to another son, whom they named Thomas William. In 1894, another daughter arrived, whom they called Sarah Jane. Their house, which had once seemed spacious, became cramped with 4 children, so Preston used his savings and some of the profits from the store to build a larger home. The new house was a 2-story structure with a wide porch and enough bedrooms for all the children. It had a proper kitchen where Louisa could bake the pies that had become famous throughout Tascosa, and a study where Preston could manage the accounts for their now thriving business. They even had indoor plumbing, a luxury that was still rare in frontier towns. James, their eldest, grew into a responsible young man who showed an aptitude for business. By the time he was 15, he was helping run the store, managing inventory and dealing with suppliers. Emma was quieter, more introspective, with a talent for drawing that expressed itself in beautiful sketches of the landscape and people around her. Thomas was the wild one, always getting into scrapes and adventures, while Sarah was the peacemaker, the one who could soothe hurt feelings and resolve conflicts. Preston watched his children grow with a mixture of pride and wonder. He taught his sons to ride and shoot, to work hard and treat people fairly. Louisa taught all the children to read and write, to appreciate beauty, and to be kind. Together, they created a home filled with love and laughter, a stark contrast to the lonely existence Preston had known before that fateful storm. In 1896, when James was 9 years old, he asked his mother about her first husband. Louisa had always been honest with the children about her past, but this was the first time one of them had asked for details. "My first husband was a good man," she told James as they sat together on the porch. He had dreams of building a life in Tascosa, and in a way, those dreams came true, just not the way he expected. "Your father and I have tried to honor his memory by creating the kind of life he would have wanted." "Do you ever wish things had been different?" James asked. "That he had survived instead." Louisa was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I wish he had not died, because no one deserves to have their life cut short that way. But I cannot wish things were different, because that would mean not having your father, not having you and your siblings. Everything we go through shapes who we become. The sad parts and the happy parts are all woven together." "That makes sense," James said thoughtfully. Then he smiled. "I am glad Father found you in the ice. It would have been lonely without you." Louisa hugged her son close. "It would have been lonely without all of you." The store continued to thrive, becoming one of the most successful businesses in Tascosa. Preston and Louisa expanded twice more, eventually taking over the building next door and knocking down the wall between them. They employed 8 people and carried everything from basic supplies to luxury goods ordered from back east. Preston still remembered vividly the day he had stumbled into that cabin, half frozen and desperate for shelter. He remembered the shock of finding Louisa encased in ice, the impossible miracle of her survival, the words she had spoken when she first looked at him with those green eyes. "You saved me." In truth, they had saved each other. She had given him purpose and family, while he had given her a second chance at life and love. As the new century approached, Tascosa began to change. The railroad came through, bringing new people and new opportunities. Some of the old-timers grumbled about progress, but Preston and Louisa embraced it. They adapted their business to serve the changing community, adding new products and services. In 1899, James left home to attend college in Dallas. It was the first time one of their children had left, and both Preston and Louisa felt the loss keenly. But they were proud of him, proud of the young man he had become. Emma followed 2 years later, going to a teaching college with plans to become an educator. Thomas and Sarah were still at home, but Preston knew it was only a matter of time before they too would spread their wings. "We are getting old," Louisa said one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset. She was 43 now, her dark hair touched with silver, but to Preston she was as beautiful as the day he had first seen her frozen in the ice. "We are not old," Preston protested. "We are seasoned." Louisa laughed. "Is that what you are calling it?" Preston, we have been together for 15 years. We have 4 children. We have gray hair. And I would not change a single moment of it, Preston said, taking her hand. Except maybe that time Thomas broke his arm falling out of the tree. Or when Sarah got the chicken pox and gave it to everyone else, Louisa added, smiling at the memory. Or when Emma decided to paint the dog blue. They laughed together, comfortable in the shared history of their life. These were the moments Preston treasured most, the quiet times when it was just the two of them, remembering all they had built together. In 1902, James returned from college with a degree in business and a bride. Her name was Catherine, and she was a sweet-natured girl from Dallas who was somewhat overwhelmed by the frontier town her new husband called home. But she adapted quickly, and Preston and Louisa welcomed her into the family with open arms. James and Catherine took over much of the day-to-day running of the store, allowing Preston and Louisa to step back slightly. They were not ready to retire completely, but it was nice to have more time for other pursuits. Preston took up woodworking, creating beautiful furniture pieces that Louisa sold through the store. Louisa expanded her baking, supplying several restaurants in town with her pies and pastries. Emma returned in 1903 and opened a small school for children whose families lived too far from town to attend the main school. She was a gifted teacher, patient and creative, and soon had a devoted following of students. Thomas, true to his restless nature, left home at 18 to try his hand at cattle ranching. Sarah, the youngest, stayed close to home, helping her mother with the baking and eventually taking over that part of the business entirely. In 1905, James and Catherine gave Preston and Louisa their first grandchild, a boy they named Preston James in honor of his grandfather. Holding his grandson for the first time, Preston felt the circle of his life complete in a way that moved him to tears. This was everything he had never known he wanted, everything that storm had blown into his life 20 years ago. Louisa stood beside him, looking down at the baby with tears in her own eyes. "He is perfect," she whispered. "Just like his grandmother," Preston replied, and she swatted his arm playfully. More grandchildren followed. Emma married a teacher from a neighboring town and had twin girls. Thomas eventually settled down with the daughter of a ranch owner and had 3 boys in quick succession. Sarah married the new doctor in town and had 2 girls. The house that had once seemed so large when it was just Preston and Louisa now overflowed with children and grandchildren on holidays and special occasions. Through it all, the love between Preston and Louisa remained the foundation on which everything else was built. They still held hands when they walked down Main Street. They still stole kisses when they thought no one was looking. They still sat together on their porch in the evenings and talked about everything and nothing. In 1910, Tascosa celebrated its 50th anniversary, and Preston and Louisa were honored as 2 of the town's founding business leaders. At the ceremony, Preston was asked to say a few words. He stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of familiar faces, and felt the weight of all the years settle on his shoulders. "I came to this town as a lonely man with no purpose and no future," he began. "I was caught in a storm that I thought would be the end of me. Instead, it was the beginning of everything. I found my wife in the most unexpected way, and together we built a life that has exceeded my wildest dreams. Tascosa gave us a place to grow and thrive, and for that, I will be forever grateful." When he sat down, Louisa squeezed his hand. "That was beautiful," she said. "It was the truth," Preston replied. As they entered their 60s, Preston and Louisa finally fully retired from the store, turning it over completely to James and his family. They spent their days working in their garden, visiting with their grandchildren, and enjoying the fruits of a life well lived. Preston's hair had gone completely white, and his body bore the aches and pains of age and hard work. Louisa moved a bit slower than she once had, and her hands sometimes hurt from arthritis. But they were content, surrounded by family and secure in their love for each other. On a cold January day in 1916, 30 years after Preston had found Louisa in the ice, they made a journey back to the cabin where it had all begun. The structure was still standing, though it was even more dilapidated now. They stepped inside and Preston lit a lantern, just as he had done 3 decades earlier. "It seems smaller than I remembered," Louisa said, looking around. "Everything seems smaller when you are older," Preston replied. He walked to the spot where the ice had been, where he had first seen her frozen face. "Sometimes I still cannot believe it really happened, that you survived something that should have killed you." Louisa came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "I told you then that I was yours forever. Did you believe me?" "I did not know what to believe," Preston admitted. "I only knew that I did not want to let you go." "And you never did," Louisa said softly. "We kept our promises to each other, Preston. We built the life James dreamed of. We raised a beautiful family, and we loved each other through everything. Not many people can say that." Preston pulled her close, holding her in the same spot where he had held her as she cried for her first husband all those years ago. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you from that first moment you opened your eyes and looked at me. I will love you until I take my last breath, and if there is anything beyond this life, I will love you there too." "I love you too," Louisa whispered. "My life truly began the day you found me. Everything before that was just preparation." They stood there for a long time, 2 people who had been given a miracle and had honored it by building a life filled with love and purpose. When they finally left the cabin and rode back toward Tascosa, Preston knew he would never return to this place again. He did not need to. Everything important had come with him, in the form of the woman riding beside him. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and sorrows. Preston's health began to fail in his late 70s. His heart, which had given him no trouble for so many years, began to wear out. The doctor told him to slow down, to rest more, but Preston was never good at being idle. He continued to work in his garden, to play with his great-grandchildren, to sit on the porch with Louisa and watch the sunsets. One evening in the spring of 1928, as they sat together as they had done thousands of times before, Preston felt a tightness in his chest. He took Louisa's hand and held it gently. "I think my time is coming," he said quietly. Louisa's eyes filled with tears, but she did not protest or try to deny what they both knew was true. "I am not ready to let you go." "I am not ready to go either," Preston said. "But we have had a good run, have we not? 42 years together. 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren so far. A business that has provided for 3 generations. A love that never wavered." "It has been more than I ever dreamed possible," Louisa said, her voice breaking. Preston lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You were my miracle, Louisa. You were the answer to prayers I did not even know to pray. Promise me you will be happy after I am gone. Promise me you will not spend the rest of your days mourning." "I cannot promise that," Louisa said through her tears. "But I promise I will live. I will spend time with our family and remember all the beautiful years we had together." Preston smiled. "That is all I ask." He died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep with Louisa holding his hand. He was 78 years old and had lived a life that far exceeded anything he had imagined possible on that day, when he had been a lonely cowboy riding through a storm. The funeral was held at the church, and it seemed like the entire town turned out to pay their respects. Preston and Louisa had been part of Tascosa for more than 4 decades, and their impact on the community was immeasurable. Person after person stood up to share stories about how Preston had helped them, had given them credit when times were tough, had offered advice and friendship freely. Louisa sat in the front pew, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and listened to the tributes. She was proud of the man Preston had been, proud of the life they had built together. But underneath, the pride was a grief so profound it felt like it might swallow her whole. After the funeral, after the visitors had left and the casseroles had been stored away, Louisa sat alone on her porch and allowed herself to truly feel the loss. Preston had been her rock, her partner, her love. The house felt empty without him, even though it was still filled with family. But she had made him a promise, and Louisa Langford Archer was a woman who kept her promises. She continued to live, to be present for her family, to find joy where she could. She baked pies with her granddaughters, told stories to her great-grandchildren about the cowboy who had found her in the ice, and maintained the garden she and Preston had planted together. She lived for another 8 years, dying peacefully at the age of 76 in 1936. Her children gathered around her bed in those final hours, and she smiled at each of them, telling them how proud she was, how blessed she had been to be their mother. "Tell me about Father," James said gently. "Tell us the story one more time." So Louisa told them about the storm, about waking up from the ice to see a stranger looking down at her with wonder and concern in his eyes. She told them about falling in love in a tiny cabin while snow piled up outside, about the words she had spoken that became the foundation of their life together. "I am yours forever." "And were you?" Emma asked softly. "Were you his forever?" "I was," Louisa said with certainty. "I am. In this life and whatever comes next, I am his and he is mine. Forever." She closed her eyes and let out one final breath, and her children knew she was gone. They buried her next to Preston in the town cemetery, under a headstone that read, "Louisa Langford Archer. Beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. Forever his, as promised." The store continued to operate for another 50 years, run by James and then by his children and grandchildren. The building eventually became a historical landmark, with a plaque telling the story of the widow who survived the ice and the lonely cowboy who found her. Tourists would visit and marvel at the tale, some believing it to be just legend, others sensing the truth at its core. But for those who knew, for the descendants of Preston and Louisa, who carried their legacy forward, the story was simply the beginning of a great love. It was proof that sometimes miracles happen, that sometimes two people find each other against all odds, and that sometimes a promise made in the midst of tragedy can become the foundation of something beautiful. In the end, it was a story about loneliness transformed into love, about loss giving way to hope, about two people who found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built a life that honored both their pasts and their future together. It was a story that would be told and retold through generations, a reminder that even in the harshest storms, even in the coldest ice, love can survive and thrive. Preston and Louisa's story became woven into the fabric of Tascosa itself, a testament to the power of second chances and the enduring strength of the human heart. And though they were both long gone, their love remained, living on in the family they had created and the legacy they had left behind, as eternal and unchanging as the promise Louisa had made on that day when she thawed and looked into Preston's eyes for the first time. "I am yours forever."